It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jared Schultz, professor and chair of the Department of Rehabilitation Counseling at the Virginia Commonwealth University. Welcome to the program, Jared. How are you?
Doing well, Gwen. Thanks for having me.
How did I do with that? I did pretty good on that title, didn't I?
I think you covered it.
I had help.
Maybe I'll throw some letters in or something after my name. I don't know.
Perfect. Yeah, and we'll put those in the show notes. We'll put those in the description below. But in all seriousness, maybe what you can do is tell us a little bit about yourself so that our audience knows what you do and who you are.
Yeah. I professionally am a counselor. I started working early on in my career with people with disabilities, and the population I started working with when I was right out of my undergrad was people with severe and persistent mental illness. And I worked in a county community program that was focused on helping them to obtain and maintain employment in the community. And so that's really where my roots are. My foundation is clinically is there. And I went on to get my master's degree in counseling. Got my Ph.D. in rehabilitation counseling, which is a specialization in the counseling field for working with people with disabilities. And since then, I've been on faculty at a number of different institutions, and I'm currently at Virginia Commonwealth University, or VCU, and I'm chairing the program here, the department here. But a lot of my background is in vocational issues, disability issues, and vocational assessment is a big area that I've developed, and transition services, helping adolescents make that transition from, kind of adolescent roles to adult roles, and living in the community.
Yeah. And this is I feel like a lot of my clients that I work with are really struggling with knowing how to do that. How do we make this transition from adolescence to adulthood? That's already developmentally challenging for humans, right? Like in general. But when we have different types of profiles that are important for us to keep in mind to help someone be as successful as possible, right? Whether that's an emotional or a developmental or a behavioral challenge or a learning challenge, right? I feel like more thoughtfulness is needed in order to kind of transition someone with more intent and more thoughtfulness, right? Like, how do we do that? Yeah. This is where I feel parents and support systems are the most anxious. As they think about, oh my gosh, I've been supported wonderfully in an IEP, let's say, and I know how to go from 9th grade to 10th grade to 11th grade to 12th grade. But what in the world do we do after that, right? Yeah. Go ahead.
What you're touching on, Gwen, is so important, because people tend to think of transition as a process that's housed within an institution or an organization, rather than a life event, or from a developmental point of view. So when we talk to special educators or to vocational rehab counselors about transition, they're thinking about, here's this period of time that services are provided, or here's an IEP meeting, and they think that the process is in the activities of the program, not that the process is housed within the individual. I have to admit, if you don't mind me being a little bit personal, my wife and I have 4 daughters, and our youngest just graduated from high school. So we're officially empty nesters now, and excited to be entering that stage of our life. All of my kids had a job at some point in high school. Now, it wasn't through the whole thing, and sometimes it was in summer and whatever, and we worked that out as our needs dictated. But unfortunately, or fortunately for my kids, they have a vocational counselor as a dad who feels that work is a very important developmental process.
Yeah.
And so in our family, that was something that we valued. It never occurred to me to go to the school and say, why aren't you finding my kid a job? And so when we throw disability into that, and I think it's a very natural thing, is that there's so many services and things happening around that disability that we forget that it's not a school or a program process. It's a personal process. Mm-hmm. And from what I've seen, family members, particularly parents, they don't know where to go for that kind of assistance. They look to the special ed programs or to the voc rehab programs, but those are limited. And I think a big thing that what you're talking about is we need to empower those families with what they need.
Yeah.
To be able to support those big transitions. And if I can just tell a quick story, I'm one of the areas that I really think applies here is what's called structural family therapy. So the author's name is Salvador Minuchin, and talking about a family's rules, roles, and boundaries, and the concept of homeostasis. And so taking that basic model, we had a clinic at one of the universities that I worked at, and one of our young clients that we were working with, he was about 23 years old, and they came to us, and it was he and his mom, and he says, I want to work, and I want to work in the community. And so we worked with him, and we ended up helping him find a job, and he was doing great, and the family was doing great. And then he got his first paycheck, and we get this emergency phone call. This is blowing up, and so we go into the home, and we sat down. We said, okay, tell us what's going on. And he says, well, I got paid, and my mom tried to take my whole paycheck, and she responds with, well, he's got to pay rent, and we've got food, and blah, 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 and she starts kind of laying out her thing. And so I said, okay, it's just, we can work through this. I stepped back. I said to her, do ordinary 23-year-old men who live on their own give their entire paycheck to their mom? And she's like, well, no, but I said, no, I understand the buts, but does that usually happen? No. So it's not the role, helping to define the role. So it's not your role to take all of his paycheck. And he's sitting over there kind of going, yeah, And I said, now, do 23-year-old men pay rent? Yeah. Is it the whole paycheck? No. Okay, let's negotiate. And so we just kind of worked through those roles and helped them to change their rules and establish some boundaries in there so that he could get his paycheck. He could be responsible to her and to pay some of that and take responsibility for those needs. But we did it in a little bit of a softer way. And it was really what we were doing is we were teaching them how to relate to each other in a new way. Now that he's not 15-year-old, and he's in this adult phase of life.
What I love about that story is what you did is you gave a frame and a structure for how to have a conversation that needed to happen, and that kind of adage, the nothing about us without us adage in the disability world and advocacy and activism world, right? That idea is, if you can presume that we can be competent in this conversation and that on some level we get it, we might need some help expressing it, organizing our thoughts about it, but we want to be included in that conversation. What you did is you gave them a framework, for both of them, a framework and a structure, to have this conversation that needed to happen. And both people, both thoughts and values were expressed. It's lovely.
Yeah. And what's interesting when we, as a clinic, because we were doing this through a clinic at the university. And so when we sat down to process this, I was talking to the students and I said, one of the assumptions that we frequently make is that someone's at fault or someone's being maliciously, purposefully interrupting things. And I said, it occurs to me that this parent has never been taught how to have this conversation. Mm-hmm. And what a critical thing to teach and to model. And so that's the benefit of having somebody from the outside who can come in and kind of mediate that is very, very helpful. But yeah, it's about, another thing that is you were talking, we talk a lot in the world of disability about the concept of empowerment.
Yep.
And what do we mean by that? I mean, it's a great word and we throw it around and we talk about, well, we need to empower people. I've had, a lot of different examples of that thrown in front of me and kind of gone, I don't think that's empowerment. I think what you're doing is actually a little more manipulative, And over the years, as I've thought about that concept, I believe that the fundamental building block of power and empowerment is choice. Yes. It's the ability to make a choice that leads someone to the position where they can influence or have an influence on a process or a person or something. And so fundamentally, if we can teach solid decision making, and that doesn't mean an outcome. That's not me saying, Gwen, here's the outcome you need to decide on, and I'm going to kind of work you through this little conversation till you get to where I want you to be.
Yep.
Rather, it's the process of understanding what a problem is, understanding and looking at different consequences and different things that happen, and helping someone, number one, to make good choices, and secondly, to take responsibility for the results of those choices, whether they're positive or negative, because that's where the personal growth happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they can fully own their choice. Yeah. Instead of being angry because their parents made the choice for them. So now I'm angry with my mom or my dad because they made me do something and I'm resentful about that. And now I have to live with some consequences that I actually didn't even want to make the choice in the first place.
Right.
And so I love that choice, it reminds me or something that we talk about is informed choice, so how do we sit down? How do we maybe map out what are all the consequences, positive and negative, just what might happen after? Do you accept those consequences potentially? And if you do accept them, then it still is your decision. I think this is so helpful too when we're not dealing with something unsafe, illegal, or amoral, right? Like when we're kind of swimming in the grays of life, like that gray area, that squishy area that we can live in, this is where we need to empower people with their voices. So I love that fundamental building block as being choice. And it's a great point that empowerment takes on and can take on many forms. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned manipulation. Do you have a good example of that? Because that could be, something, I don't know. I know I'm putting you on the spot with that, but.
It's interesting. I was watching a video of a student intern one time, and he was working with a client. And so it was during an internship kind of a thing, and I was evaluating his counseling session. And what was really fascinating was, I don't remember the exact conversation, but it was something along this line. What do you want to do for a job? And the client said, well, I was thinking about such and such. And when he said that, this counselor leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and kind of looked off to the side, just closed down his body language. Mm. And that client was perceptive enough to go, oh, he doesn't like that idea. And so he changed. He says, but I'd be happy with doing, McDonald's or something. And right when he said that, this student sat forward, tell me more about that. And so he started going along. And when he said something else, this person sat back and it was really subtle if you don't know what you're looking for. And if I had talked to that student, and it's, look, you're shutting this person down. You're driving them to an outcome that you want, not the one that they want. They would have said, what are you talking about? I'm just doing I'm asking my open-ended questions. I'm doing all of these things I'm supposed to do. But it was a very subconscious, and that's a very subtle example. There are very overt examples. Where I've had clients where the parents come in and say, I'm not comfortable with them doing that job. I want them to do this. Or when I've had professionals say, well, that placement will require a lot more effort. This one's the easiest one to do. This client said they want to do something in graphic design. I don't have any contacts to get them a job in graphic design, but I do at the local, Ace Hardware store or something, doing something there. And so funneling people into programs and decisions, this comes right back, Gwen, to your concept that you mentioned of informed choice. I've known a lot of people who, professionals who, they buy into informed choice until the informed choice goes against what they want. And that's a hard thing because, and I don't mean to come off as being critical of the professionals because they're, in a sense, they're in a kind of a hard place because they're being evaluated on work that they don't have final control over. I mean, if they're doing it right, this person has the right to make the decisions that they want to make and all of those kinds of things. But at the same time, they need to be aware of their own motivations. And it's coming back to just in that line of thinking about, am I being manipulative? And that's a very strong word. I've also heard people say, well, that's not manipulation. That's just providing the hard, cold facts of life. And it's like, you know what? I think life beats us up enough. I don't think it's your job to beat us up anymore. But when we're talking about that goal, whatever it is, if we've gone through the informed choice process, and it's what you were talking about, here's some really great things about that. Here's some really kind of risky, scary things about that. Let's look at this from a lot of different angles. And if they decide on something that as a professional, I don't necessarily think is the best thing, but we've gone over all of my concerns and they've expressed, no, this is what I want to do. I appreciate your input, but this is what I want to do. Then my obligation as a professional is to do everything I can to support them in that decision to see if it'll be successful. And I think that one of the biggest ways that we see, I don't want to say manipulation, but we see that interaction kind of get tainted a little bit, is professionals at times will go, okay, well, you made this decision. That's going to blow up in your face. I'll be here when it all falls apart. Come back to me then. And it's kind of I'm not going to support that because that's not what I want to do. And when it doesn't work out, then come back to me and then we'll start over or something. And I don't think that's right conceptually. I don't think that's right ethically. When that client, through the informed choice process, makes that decision, we need to try and support that as much as we can. Now, it may not work out. It may not be as successful as we want it to be. But if indeed that was their choice, then it's like you said earlier, they can take responsibility for that. And they can learn from that. and they can grow from that, and they can say, you know what, I need to do this or that to increase my chances. And because if it's not their choice, it's Jared was really railroading me into that, and I didn't want to do it anyway, so I have nothing to change.
Right. And we lose, I think there's some downsides or some consequences therapeutically that happen from that, right? One is I don't trust my therapeutic support providers or my providers or people that are trying to help me. They don't see me, and so I disconnect from support and therapy, let's just say. And the other is I think it's disempowering. Like if like the whole goal is to empower, when we do things like that, we disempower, and we, I think, unintentionally like zap motivation. Because if I'm not owning things, I'm not motivated to do anything. Actually, it's better if I disengage because it's just easier, you know?
Yeah.
I think, you know, what, as you're talking about this process, what comes to my mind is the complexity of the work, right? Because I am very sure that most of the time, everyone involved on a team, in a family, people supporting, have the best intentions, right? Mm-hmm. The intentions, I mean, people who come into this line of work really have great intentions. Our clients have the best intentions to have a happy, productive, successful, life. Families as well want that for their adult children. And that we're trying really hard. A lot of times we're trying really hard. But there is an incredible amount of self-awareness, I think, that's needed in what we're talking about. I mean, even as a therapist, right? If you don't understand your biases or your own family values or the values you've been raised with and how you keep those neutral or at bay when you're trying to help someone, mm-hmm. that is going to kind of start to bleed into the work. And in those small but yet powerful ways, that the leaning back, the leaning forward. And we know, how much of communication is nonverbal. Oh, yeah. Like really in the 80%. That's how powerful, the nonverbal gestural kinds of things, that's the role that plays. If we can go back to informed choice because of this process. Jared, what happens, and maybe this is what gets answered by vocational assessments, mm-hmm. but what happens when a client says, I want to get a job as an astronaut. Mm-hmm. That's what I want. And the team is like, mm-hmm. that's not, no, you don't even like math, right? Oh, whatever, right? Okay. Realistically, how do we help this person come to whatever decisions are going to come to about being an astronaut? But and again, maybe this weaves into vocational assessment and understanding where abilities lie and these types of things. But usually that's what parents say to me. They want to be a video game designer. They don't even like to X. How can they be a video game designer? That's just a pipe dream.
It's a great question. There's a process that all of us go through in refining who we are in our work environment, in our work identity, in the things that we do. From the time that I was 14 years old or 13 years old to when I was a sophomore in college, I thought I wanted to be a physician. I thought I wanted to be an eye doctor, actually, an ophthalmologist. Our family had a good friend who was an ophthalmologist, and I was like, that seems like a good gig, And I remember my freshman year of college talking to my dad on the phone, and I was struggling in chemistry. And I'm like, okay, I think that if I can just pull this much of a grade or this, I can still get into medical school. I'm working all the angles. And my dad said, Jared, doctors do chemistry. you know, and, he's sitting there going, what are you thinking, But I had to go through my own process. I had to go through the struggles and all of that. And one morning, it was kind of weird for me. I woke up and I knew I wasn't going to medical school. It was kind of like I don't know if it was I was asleep, my mind was churning on this stuff or whatever. And then I was like, okay, I'm cool with that. Now I just need to figure out what I want to do. Now it just so happens I was working in a psychiatric treatment center just for a job while I was in college, but I really enjoyed it. And that's how I was really exposed to the counseling and that kind of a thing. When we hear those long-term goals, immediately those of us who have some experience go, oh man, there's no way. But that long-term goal, there's a couple of things we need to remember. Number one, there's a process that's required to get there. That doesn't mean that they're going to be an astronaut tomorrow. And there's a lot of different hoops that need to be jumped through and all of that kind of thing. The other thing to always remember is usually we hear those vocational goals are the most salient and visible type of jobs that person has been exposed to. Very frequently, kids who experience disability as adolescents are not being asked to get a job in the community in the summer, to go out and develop that work identity, those kinds of things. And a lot of times, and that's very understandable, Gwen. I mean, when a parent has a child with a disability, all of a sudden there's all this disability stuff coming at them, and it fills up the windshield, and they can't see anything else. And I understand that, and it's hard to take that and go, okay, we're going to put that stuff aside. What are you doing for a job this summer? Is that appropriate? Can we help you find something? Whatever it is, or let's do some volunteer work together, and let's build some of those social skills. And all of those things expose us to the world of work. And it's not just the job I want to do, but it's the type of work I want to do, the environments I enjoy being in. And so for the most part, I think a lot of those expressions are expressions of a lack of exposure to the wide variety of work. I can't tell you how many times I've done vocational assessments with adolescents and been told they want to be an NBA star or a rapper.
Oh yeah.
Like every other kid at least. And you're sitting there and you're like going, okay, you're 5'2", $110 soaking wet. You're not going to the NBA, but that when you dig in and you ask the questions, the second and the third level question is where you get the depth of understanding. And it's like, what is it about being an MBA? Oh, they're popular. They're visible. People want to be like them. They're a lot of money. What would money do for you? Money would do, I could buy this. That's where you start getting at the fundamental values set. It's the values delineation process, really, is what we're talking about, where you're saying, here's what you've, accurately or inaccurately, you've wrapped all your values into this job. Now let's start to pick that apart to understand your values. Because if those are the things that you value, how about if we can help you find an alternative or something that may be slightly related? You might not work for the NBA, but you could sell Jordans at the Foot Locker, or something like that. It just kind of depends on what that person values. And, I had a client one time that, she was bound and determined to work at Burger King. And in the world of job placement and disability, we talk about food, flowers, and filth. The most common job placements are in food industry, landscaping, type of work or janitorial. And so she says, I want to work at Burger King. And I'm thinking, well, we can probably find you something else, we don't have to go down that road. I said, why Burger King? And she says, I like the uniforms. And that was her motivator. I mean, okay, and it's funny because, we stepped in, we got her a job, and she was successful in that. But the thing that was really motivating her was something very different than what I was thinking.
Yeah.
And so I had to back up a little bit and listen. But yeah, the other thing that we can do, let me, if you don't mind me telling another story.
No, please.
I had a client one time who, he was in a car accident, and actually it wasn't his fault, and had a great deal of money come to him as a result of this accident. And he came in and he sat down. He goes, here's what I'm going to do is, I'm going to start my own landscaping company. Now, I'd worked with this person for a few years, and I knew his capacities pretty well. What I would envision of that was he would go out and he would buy $40,000 worth of lawnmowers and weed eaters and maybe a new truck and that kind of a thing, and it would sit in his front yard, and nothing would happen. So this is kind of the same kind of an idea where you said, what happens if something's a little bit, and yet I didn't want to say, well, that's not going to work, because that's not an empowering thing. Mm-hmm. And so I said to him, it's entirely up to you, but are you okay with us talking through this? And he says, yeah, that'd be good. And I said, okay, when people start a business, usually what they do is they build a business plan. Would you be willing to work through that with me? And so he goes, oh, okay. And so we got a template for a business plan. And I started asking him about billing and insurance and finding new clients. And, and as we got into it, and I wasn't going, dude, you can't do this. You can't. I'm like, how are you going to do this? I was trying to, and if he had pulled off a great business plan and showed that, great, and it's you, run with it. But it was not very long before he realized, okay, I don't have this skill set, and this is more than I thought it was. He envisioned 8 hours riding a lawnmower around without all the other stuff it takes to run a business. And so in that respect, then, the conversation helped him to make that decision on his own. And then it's like, okay, now that's okay. But what can we do? What was it about that? Let's go back and let's look at that idea. Why did that seem intriguing to you? What was nice about that? And we could try and build on those kinds of things.
Yeah. So really the conversation acting as like that formal vehicle to drive insight, right? Mm-hmm. In some way, as you're talking about this story, it makes me think of many of the clients that I have that want a driver's license. Mm-hmm. And that probably not being a great idea. Mm-hmm. But what I've done with this as well is for us to lay out all the steps of getting a driver's license and what it means to be a safe driver. And we might practice those with other types of skills, like being able to be responsive to your environment and being able to pay attention for certain periods of time. And mm-hmm. we just lay it out, and then we do experiments. Mm-hmm. Okay, if you don't know, okay, let's just give it a try. And, it's pretty clear that, in my experience anyway, that people in general are bad at predicting outcomes. Mm-hmm. There's just too many factors that come to play in that moment's decision, or that moment's whatever that's happening at that moment. And so I am oftentimes surprised by what my clients can do. They often surprise me, not because I underestimated them, but because I find awe and wonder in like, oh my God, you did that. I like, whoa, like that's awesome. But whenever I've done a stepwise thing like that, where we've laid out just the steps, like you just did you did a business plan, right? They can get down with like, oh, there should be a safety plan behind getting a driver's license. I mean, or if, you want to buy a Tesla, because that's another thing that happens, or, and what you might need to do that. By the time we get to a certain step where they're stalling, then they say to me, I don't want to get my license anymore. I'd rather figure out how to use Uber. Yeah. And it's like, okay, let's do that.
Yeah.
But they did it on their own, versus me saying, gosh, you have Down syndrome. That's not a good idea. Like, right. I would never say that.
Right.
I would never say that to somebody, So, but that happens a lot, because I would say even with that diagnosis, when they say they want to have a driver's license, everyone's like, no, you can't. Sorry.
Gwen, it comes back to that concept of owning the choice.
Yeah.
It absolutely does. And, we proceed if you proceed in kind of a developmental manner where it's like, okay, I don't see it right now, but maybe we get you there, but what's it going to take to get you there? And you have them engage at each of those stages as you go forward, then the decision to not do it is theirs. And it opens up, then they can own that. I mean, and we say that concept of owning that, that kind of comes out, and that's kind of a term we use in our field quite a bit. But what that means is taking responsibility for the outcome, number one, and learning to be okay with it. So, that whole conversation about driving, maybe I don't want to drive. Okay, let's talk about driving. What would driving a car do for you? Mm-hmm. When you envision yourself doing that, well, it's freedom. It's being able to go places. It's being mobile, or it's status, or it's being recognized by my friends as, it's being cool. Okay, those are other kinds of things. And are there other ways you can be mobile? Uber, public transit, whatever. Are there other ways that you can engage your friends and help them to see the value that you bring, other than something kind of as superficial as a car? It's great teaching moments, fantastic teaching moments right there at those aha places where that's like, okay, maybe not, maybe not for me. But man, what a great thing for them to own that, for that to be their realization. And then it's like, okay, now going forward, I think what you're after is great. I think the need to be recognized by our friends is great. It's important. It's part of who we are as human beings. How do we go about doing that? It's not just driving, And those conversations help to move the ball forward just a little bit at a time. And when we come in and we're like, no, you can't drive, or no, that job's not good enough, or what we're doing is we're making that decision for them. Mm-hmm. And I got to be honest, I've been surprised more often than I probably would guess.
Yeah.
Where it's like, okay, maybe not tomorrow you're an astronaut, but let's talk about, what does it take? An astronaut needs to be able to get up in the morning and go do a job. So let's start there. Mm-hmm. And they do. And they start moving along, and the improvement is incremental. But it shows up when they're motivated to do those things. But if I just said, no, that's not what you're doing, here's what you're going to do, or here's what here's two options, you pick. Well, that's not an informed choice. That's, here's two options, you pick, is pretty lame choice.
Yeah. Yeah. And, and again, this is why I think where I see this kind of chronic amotivation, like I'm not motivated to be part of my life. I don't want to actually make decisions, or classically when I ask a client a question and they look to someone else for the answer, you know, and it's like, oh, okay. I actually really want to know what you think because it's your life. And it's even, I think, going back to your story about the structured family therapy, Minuchin's kind of model of rules, roles, and boundaries. It's like providing the system, because we know our clients stay with their families for a longer period of time after high school. We know that they need a longer runway, softer landing, like into the adult world. Providing and empowering the system with these frameworks, with these strategies in which to communicate and empower. Even like for me, thinking about like I statements, just that alone of being able to have an I statement, or being able to say to a parent, who's worried? Like, whose problem is this to solve that the homework isn't getting turned in? You're more worried about it than they are. And so there's not, two people don't worry about things like this. Like you're worrying for everybody. And so therefore they can't own it. And so whose problem is that to solve? But even those types of, it's like, oh, okay, got it. An I statement. I'm worried that you're not going to turn in your homework. I'm worried about it, which is making me a little crazy. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. That even coming and having that conversation with their adult child or their teen, at that time, that shifts responsibility of even the emotional labor that's happening in a family, which is why I think what we've been talking about is so complicated. Like our intention today was to talk about the nitty gritty of vocational assessment, which we're going to need to do because like we won't do that necessarily today. But more importantly, it's setting up the mindsets and frameworks for how to support the process of moving from adolescence to adulthood. Like that's high level first. Vocational assessment is part of that piece, but how do we empower, even if like someone's listening to this and it's like, oh, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I start shifting that mindset kind of trickles down into daily behavior is my, it's my fantasy.
Yeah, no, I've often thought, Gwen, that the work that we do in transition, ideally at some point we would work ourselves out of a job, that there wouldn't be a need for a professional. There would just be the family we've got a lot of catching up to do to get there, I think. I had an interesting conversation with a colleague of mine. We were talking about services in rural environments. And, frequently in a rural town, you don't have as many counselors and support people and whatever. And I made the comment, and this was pretty early in my career. I said, man, if we could get out there and really help those rural areas. And my colleague, who's was a bit older than me, he said, or possibly learn from them. And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, he goes, most of the rural areas that I've been to, it's because there's not that, it's a community thing, and instead of going to the special ed teacher, the transition specialist, or the rehab counselor, whoever, and saying, why aren't you getting my kid a job? In a more rural environment, it's like, hey, Bob, my kid needs a job this summer. Do you got anything? Yeah, send him. And Bob knows the kid, and they've gone to church together, and they've hung out together, and they've gone fishing or whatever. And it's like, yeah, have him come buck hay at my, in my field for the summer, and I'll pay him for it. It's so, there's a lot less formal kinds of things. And some of the best, I think, work that I've done is really around helping the families to do that. Helping them to understand the process of finding employment and what that looks like. So, for example, I was approached by a family. They had a daughter who was diagnosed as being on the spectrum. She was at this point, I think, about 30 years old. And, so I brought her in and the parents, and we talked about what her goals were and what she wanted to do and those kinds of things. And then I did some formal vocational assessments with her. Her reading and language skills were high enough that she could do that. Did some of that vocational piece, and then we brought it all together. And I sat down with the family. I said, okay, now what? Here we've got all of this information about, here's the job cluster area, and we've kind of refined that goal a little bit. And now what? And I said, this is where your family comes into play. And let me teach you a little bit about networking and networking for a job. And we talked about bringing the first level family members, which was her family of origin, her immediate family. So it was a few siblings and their spouses. They were all, adults at that time. And they came together and they brainstormed, who do we know in these different areas? And I kind of laid it out in a step-by-step thing, and Dad and Mom ran the meeting. They, here's what we're doing, and everybody got on board, and they generated a list of 15 people or something like that in that second order of network. It's not the first order, it's the second level. And said, okay, now what you do is you go out and you talk to those people and you ask them about what their jobs is like and what their work is like. And you have her go out and do some job shadowing and learn more about that environment, if that fits in with her. And, and so this is not a passive thing.
Yeah.
And then one thing you always want to ask is there anyone else that you think we should talk to about this type of a job? Because we know actually from research that it's the second and the third level of the network that produces the jobs, not the first level. Mm-hmm. More frequently, it's who people know or who knows the people they know. And so you're always asking for that refer. So I coached this family through some of these things. And sure enough, they came back after that meeting and the dad says, I realized that I see so-and-so every week, and he runs this hotel chain, and she was interested in working in a hotel or something, He went and talked to him, boom, she got a job and she's working in the, but that's that level of coaching and helping, because we forget as adults how we kind of got here.
Yes.
And,
yes.
the stepping stones that it takes. And, the other thing, Gwen, that I think is really important when we're talking about some of those first and second jobs, a couple of things that I think families and clinicians need to remember. Number one is that their jobs are developmental. They're cumulative. You don't ever leave a job and just absolutely forget everything you learned when you were there.
Yeah,
I would hope. Okay.
Yes.
So you need to look at, especially with adolescents, it's been my experience that a lot of times families are so anxious about this that when they finally find a job and it seems to be working, they're like, good, check that off, job done. Okay, well, I've had more than one job, and, so understanding that there is a repetitive process here that we need to be open to. Now, if that first job, that child that you have likes that, they feel fulfilled by it, the employer likes having them there, and they don't want to quit, great. Don't force it, run with it, let them do that. But usually what I try to do with my clients is, okay, here's what we're going to do. Let's set a goal for 4 to 6 months, somewhere in there. that as much as you don't like this job, because everybody's had a job they don't like,
Mm-hmm.
and there's something to learn from it.
Mm-hmm.
If nothing else, it's learning how to appropriately go to a job and be a part of a working team and all of those things. So one of the things, let's set a goal that you're not going to quit for 4 months. And let's see, and if they do, it's not the end of the world. You process it and you move on. But help them to get past that first and second and third days, because those first few days are always the hardest.
Mm-hmm.
They're always the most tiring. They're always the most challenging. And help them to get into that place where they're in a groove a little bit more. And then you can start to have a real conversation about what they're doing. The other thing that allows for is, okay, after that period of time, what would be the next step? Let's look at this developmentally. What did you like about that? Can we refine your long-term goals and all of those kinds of things? And so I try to help parents and clients remember that there's multiple cycles to this, and we need to kind of wrap our head around that, and learn from each of those experiences.
Yeah, I love this idea of trusting in the process, and that who we are today is a cumulative product or effect of what we've experienced in our lifetime. When you were talking, it made me reflect back on some of the jobs that I had. And I've had.
I'm sorry to re-traumatize you.
I know, right? I was like, oh, I thought I repressed that. And some of those, they taught me a lot. Even though they weren't my favorite, they sure taught me a lot sometimes of what I didn't like. Mm-hmm. They taught me about how to advocate, or maybe I botched that advocacy, but if we can stay curious versus judgmental, when we can stay open-minded and expansive to understanding, okay, all of us go through these iterations. But if we can kind of not get in our own way with thought things that can happen when a job doesn't work out or something doesn't happen, we can really learn, I think, a lot. And that's where I think a professional can be really helpful, which is to tether the family and the client, to remind them that this is a developmental process. It is normal, and how do we reframe our experiences to empower us versus disempower us? And it's not, I don't think what I'm saying is let's just look through life through rose-colored glasses and pretend everything is great. It's not that. We have enough character building moments in our life. And how many times do our clients come to us without any successes?
Yeah.
They don't have enough successes. The
reframing of those experiences. The average tenure of the entry level position is it's less than 2 months. I mean, your average person that gets an entry level job quits within just a few months. It's not. I mean, think of all the people who have been hired at McDonald's and quit in the first couple of weeks because they don't like it.
Yeah.
So employers, I mean, sometimes we hold our clients with disabilities and our family members to a higher standard. It's like, you've been working there, you've only been there for 11 months. Well, dude, that's like 3 times the national average. They're doing pretty good,
Yep.
You'll have to look that actual statistic up, but I think that's about where it's at.
Do we need to fact check that, Jared? We'll
yeah.
No, but you're right though. And this is what parents need, I think, sometimes, is someone to give them information that they wouldn't have to have. Why would a parent know that information? You know what I mean?
I had an employer when I first started in the field, and he had a janitorial service. And I had a client, and I went to him and I said, Mike, I've got a client. He's interested in working for you. I'd done my assessments. So I could tell you exactly what his productivity rate was and all of these different things. And I said, now I'm not going to sugarcoat this. He's pretty slow. I mean, he only has, a 60, 65% productivity rate compared to someone without a disability. But he's never missed a day. He will be there day in and day out, and you can rely on him. And Mike told me, he goes, you know what? He goes, this information is so helpful to me. He goes, and he ended up hiring this client. And he said, because to me, he goes, Jared, you don't understand. When I put an ad in the paper, this is back when we had papers. When he goes, when I put an ad out there, so I guess the equivalent nowadays would be something online, Indeed or Job Monster or something. When I put something out there, I have no idea what's coming through the door. And with this client that I had, he knew exactly how to use him. And he goes, I will take 65 steady pays over gone half the time because they can't make it to work or whatever. Yep. Every day of the week, I'll take that steady person. And, and I think we forget sometimes that people can fit in a lot of different ways, and the needs of the employers are very different in a lot of different ways. My first boss, and this is a really important lesson that I learned early, and really is kind of an emotional one for me. One of the reasons I've stayed in the field for so long. I remember I had a client who functionally was really challenged. And she had expressed to my boss that she wanted to work in the community. And so my boss came to me and he says, Jared, he goes, so-and-so wants to work in the community. And I just looked at him. I said, really? I'm like, come on, man. And I was having these kind of this reaction to it. And he said to me, he said something that I'll never forget, Gwen. He said, Jared, I firmly believe that there's a place for everyone in the workforce who wants to be a part of the workforce. Now, your job is to go find that spot where she fits in. And I absolutely fundamentally believe that there's a place within the workforce for everybody in some capacity or other. Now, obviously there's some caveats to that. If somebody just functionally is so low functioning that they may not be able to do some things. But I think that standard or that bar is a lot lower than people think it is. Mm-hmm. And it takes a little creativity at times. It takes a little bit of effort to work around how to accommodate, how to restructure jobs, how to do task analysis, how to do a lot of these different basic skills for being able to say, okay, to an employer, here's what you need, and here's how we can get this person there to do it. But we can do that a lot more than we think we can, and we can be very successful with it. But we've got to get past our own biases, and we've got to get past our own thoughts on how a job has to be or how it needs to be structured. And it really comes back around to looking at it from a strengths-based approach.
Yep. Yeah. That's so fantastic. I mean, I think we're going to need to have another conversation for sure, because this has been incredibly insightful for me, I will say. And if, this information can help anyone listening, I think from a hope perspective, that there is hope, with the right help, there is hope. And that you see that on a daily basis is so great. Jared, if someone's listening to this and they want to know more about you or get in touch with you or know more about the programs, I mean, what's the best way for them to do that?
Actually, I'm on our faculty website. Listed on our faculty website. So if you just did a Google search for VCU Rehabilitation Counseling Department. That'll get you to our department. And then I think there's a link to our team. And I'm listed there. You know, my email is there. Shoot me an email or whatever you want.
Perfect. Yes. And as someone who's done that, you do respond. So we can say that.
That was just you, Gwen.
That's just me. Thank you, Jared. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your talents and your expertise today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.